Imagine this. It's 1873. You've just arrived in New York Harbor after crossing the Atlantic on a ship that smelled of sweat, salt, and sickness. You've left behind famine, war, and hopelessness, believing America is the land of golden streets and opportunity. But as you step into the crowded streets of Lower Manhattan, you realize something dreadful. The streets aren't paved with gold. They're paved with mud, rats, and human waste. You are one of the hundreds of thousands of immigrants, Irish, Italian, Jewish, German, Polish, flooding into the United States during the 19th century. And you need somewhere to live. You have no money. You don't speak the language. And the landlords, the so-called tenement kings, know that desperation has a price. They take you to a narrow brick building on Mulberry Street. It looks solid from the outside, 4 or 5 stories high, narrow but tall, built from red bricks blackened by coal smoke. It looks like safety, but when the door closes behind you, the air changes, the light vanishes, and you realize you've just stepped into one of the most hellish environments ever created by modern civilization. This is the 19th century tenement, and you wouldn't survive here, not for 24 hours. Inside, the stench is overwhelming. Rotten food, sweat, urine. The walls sweat moisture from leaking pipes and human breath. You climb a stairwell that is barely wide enough for one person, covered in a slick film of grease and soot. The only light comes from a gas lamp, flickering weakly, casting distorted shadows. Each floor opens into narrow hallways lined with doors. Behind each door lives a family, sometimes 2, maybe 12 people in one room. A room no larger than a small bedroom today. There's no bathroom, no running water. A single window, if you're lucky. And that window doesn't open to the outside world. It opens to a narrow air shaft shared with 50 other families. A hollow well of filth where garbage and human waste are thrown. That air shaft, called the lung of the tenement, doesn't bring in fresh air. It brings in disease. It's nighttime now, and as you lie on a straw mattress with 6 other people, your children, your spouse, your neighbor's baby, you hear the sounds of the city's underbelly. The coughing never stops. The rats crawl across your legs. The baby in the next room has been crying for hours. She's burning up with fever. No one calls a doctor. Doctors cost money. And the hospitals are worse than the rooms you're already in. So the family prays, and the baby dies before sunrise. They wrap her in a sheet, carry her down the stairs, and leave her body at the curb. A city cart will pick it up later. No one says a word, because in the tenements, death is as common as hunger. By the mid-1800s, over 2/3 of New York City's population lived in tenements. What began as simple worker housing for a growing industrial city quickly devolved into a human labyrinth, dark, suffocating, and deadly. Developers built as many as possible, as cheaply as possible. No plumbing, no ventilation, no fire escapes. The goal wasn't comfort, it was profit. If a single tenement could hold 20 families, it would soon hold 80, and each paid rent. Even the poorest could be squeezed for a few dollars. The landlords didn't care if you lived or died. They only cared that your rent arrived on time. The result was a new form of urban hell, one that transformed human beings into ghosts, gasping for air inside America's growing cities. Now, imagine it's summer. Inside your room, the temperature hits over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The air is thick, unmoving. The walls trap the heat like an oven. The floors are soaked with sweat and spilled water. People sleep on the roof to escape the heat. Entire families laid out under the stars, bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder. From above, the tenement rooftops look like refugee camps. Children cry. Men cough blood. Women fan themselves with old newspapers, whispering prayers. And then, someone screams. A baby rolls over in the heat, smothered to death. It happens almost every night. Winter is worse. You huddle around a small coal stove, the only source of warmth. The smoke fills the room because the chimney is cracked and clogged with soot. Your eyes sting. Your lungs ache. And yet, if you run out of coal, you'll freeze before morning. Many families burn anything they can find: broken furniture, old shoes, trash, anything that burns. The air turns toxic, heavy with fumes. Children grow up with blackened lungs before they turn 5. Tuberculosis spreads like wildfire. The newspapers call it the White Plague. In the tenements, they call it simply the cough. Once you start coughing blood, everyone knows it's only a matter of time. But disease wasn't the only killer here. Fire was constant. One overturned lamp, one spark from a stove, and an entire building could go up in minutes. There were no fire exits, no alarms, no way out. Hundreds of people trapped in stairwells, suffocating in smoke. Firefighters would arrive too late, dragging out burned bodies of mothers, clutching their children. These weren't accidents. They were inevitabilities, built into the walls themselves. And the city knew it. They just didn't care. By the 1880s, the tenements were the beating, infected heart of American industrialization. Every sweatshop, every garment factory, every dockyard drew its workers from these brick cages. Children as young as 6 worked 12-hour days in factories, only to come home to rooms crawling with lice. Women washed laundry for wealthier families, scrubbing clothes in freezing water until their fingers bled. Men worked on docks or in slaughterhouses, breaking their backs for pennies. Then they all returned to the same disease-ridden rooms, the same air that stank of poverty and despair. America called it progress, but to live in a tenement was to experience the underside of progress, the part history books prefer to forget. You walk outside one morning to buy bread. The streets are a maze of pushcarts and horse manure. You pass a row of children sitting on the curb. One is barefoot, another picking at lice in her hair. The youngest is chewing on a piece of wood because she's hungry. Across the street, a man lies motionless near a gutter. He froze to death the night before. People step around him like he's invisible. That's what life in the tenements does. It numbs you to suffering, to loss, to humanity itself. Reporters eventually began to notice. One of them, Jacob Rees, was a Danish immigrant who had lived in those same rooms. In 1890, he published How the Other Half Lives, a book filled with photographs of the tenements. The images shocked America. Children sleeping in alleys, women hunched over washtubs in windowless rooms, men sprawled across floors like corpses. For the first time, the comfortable upper classes saw what their city truly looked like. Not marble buildings and grand theaters, but human misery stacked floor by floor. Rees's book ignited outrage, but outrage doesn't always lead to change. Because even as politicians debated housing reform, the landlords continued collecting rent. And people, desperate, hungry people, kept coming. By the turn of the century, tenement reform laws had been passed, demanding better light, air, and sanitation. But those laws only applied to new buildings. Millions still lived in the old ones, unchanged, untouched, unlivable. The landlords found loopholes. They nailed up fake windows, whitewashed walls, and bribed inspectors. And so, the cycle continued. The tenement became a symbol of America's dark contradiction, the nation of dreams built on the backs of the poor. Immigrants had come seeking life. What they found was survival. In the next part of this story, you'll see how life inside the tenements began to breed resistance. How the forgotten poor began to fight back against the system that trapped them. Because out of the stench, sickness, and sorrow, a movement was born. The tenements tried to crush the human spirit, but somehow it refused to die. The dawn in the tenements doesn't look like light. It seeps in, pale and weak, filtered through soot-stained glass and the smoke of last night's fires. You wake to coughing, always coughing, and the shuffle of hundreds of feet down the stairs. Another day of survival begins. The factory whistle screams somewhere beyond the rooftops. Men pull on threadbare coats, women tie rags around their hair, and children, still half asleep, are shaken awake. There's no breakfast, only stale bread soaked in water to make it chewable. Then everyone leaves, thousands of them, spilling into the narrow streets like a river of ghosts. The tenement empties, but it doesn't fall silent. Inside, the air continues to hum. The drip of leaking pipes, the distant cry of an infant, the scurry of rats behind the walls. And somewhere, in a basement room that never sees sunlight, an old woman rocks in a chair, mending clothes for pennies. She remembers Ireland, fields of green, open skies. But here, there is no horizon, only brick and shadow. As industry consumes the city, the tenements become its beating heart. Every shirt, every shoe, every tool that leaves the factory carries a trace of this place. The sweat, the sickness, the despair of the people who made it. They work 14 hours a day, then come home to rooms smaller than the factory closets they clean. Children learn to sew before they learn to read. At night, their small fingers ache. Their eyes burn from the candle smoke. When one falls asleep at the table, the foreman raps his knuckles. Work doesn't stop for exhaustion. It stops for death. But beneath this misery, something stirs. A spark, faint but growing. The people who live here begin to see that their suffering isn't fate, it's design. And design can be changed. In a corner of the Lower East Side, a group of women gathers in a basement. They whisper in a dozen different accents: German, Yiddish, Italian, English, united by exhaustion and rage. They talk about their landlords, about the filth, about their children coughing through the night. One woman says she paid extra for clean water and received none. Another says her husband fell from a scaffold at the docks, and his body was never found. A man enters, not rich, but better dressed. He's from a local reform mission. He tells them they have rights. They laugh at first. Rights? For the poor? In America, maybe? But not for them. Still, he listens. And for the first time, someone writes down their complaints, their names, their addresses, their stories. Those stories will soon appear in newspapers, accompanied by sketches of their rooms. Children sleeping beside open sewers, mothers boiling laundry in water black as tar. The city begins to see them, not as workers, not as tenants, but as victims of its own success. By the 1890s, the tenements had become impossible to ignore. Reporters, priests, doctors, they all descended into the slums with notebooks and cameras. What they saw shocked even the hardened. In some buildings, the death rate was higher than on battlefields. In others, infants were buried before they were named. Outrage spreads like fire. Clergy preach about moral decay. Reformers demand sanitation laws. Doctors speak of contagion. And slowly, politicians begin to feel the pressure. But change in the tenements is never simple. Each improvement costs someone money, and landlords have no intention of losing profit. They argue that tenants should be grateful for a roof at all. They claim poverty is a choice, that cleanliness is a virtue the poor lack. Still, the voices grow louder. Women's organizations begin collecting rent receipts, documenting abuses. Immigrant associations set up soup kitchens, literacy programs, and legal aid. In dark alleys and overcrowded courtyards, a quiet revolution brews, not with guns, but with awareness. One night, in a room lit only by candlelight, a young girl named Maria stitches dresses beside her mother. She's 12, but her hands move like an adult's. Her fingers are covered in tiny cuts, each sealed with dried blood. She asks her mother what life will be like when they move out. Her mother laughs, not cruelly, But because she can't imagine it, no one leaves the tenements. They die in them. Yet Maria dreams anyway. She hears about schools opening nearby, where children of immigrants can learn English for free. She wants to go. Her mother says maybe, someday, when there's time. But there's never time. Still, dreams matter. They start small. A classroom here, a church shelter there, but they multiply. And each one chips away at the walls that confine them. By the early 1900s, reformers like Lawrence Vaylor and the charity organization Society push for sweeping housing codes. They demand light, ventilation, fireproof stairways, running water. The landlords fight back, bribing inspectors, forging documents. But the truth is too large to hide now. Photographs and testimonies flood the newspapers. Even the wealthy can't deny it. Their maids, their tailors, their cooks, all come from these buildings. Disease doesn't respect class lines. When tuberculosis spreads from the slums to the uptown districts, panic replaces indifference. Suddenly, the health of the poor becomes everyone's problem. Construction begins on new model tenements, clean, bright, with windows in every room. Charities buy up old buildings and tear them down. For the first time, inspectors actually enter apartments, measuring air shafts, checking for plumbing. It's not paradise, but it's progress. Yet progress never reaches everyone. For every new building, 10 old ones remain. For every family rehoused, 10 more move in from the next ship. The tenement system adapts, mutates, survives. And those who live in it learn to survive too. They form unions. They strike for better wages, safer conditions, shorter hours. They march through the streets carrying banners written in languages the city still struggles to understand. From those marshes will come something bigger, the first whispers of modern labor rights. The fight for housing, health, and dignity doesn't end in the tenements. It begins there. Night falls again. The lamps flicker. Families crowd around dinner tables, eating soup stretched thin with water. Outside, snow begins to fall, coating the rooftops in white. From above, the city looks peaceful, almost beautiful. But beneath that quiet, behind every window, the struggle continues. A boy coughs in his sleep. A woman prays over an empty bowl. A landlord counts his coins by candlelight. And the city dreams of progress, blind to the cost. Morning again, and the streets of the Lower East Side are alive long before sunrise. Pushcarts rattle down the cobblestones, horses clop past overloaded with crates, and smoke rises from hundreds of chimneys, blurring the skyline into a gray haze. The city breathes, heavy, uneven, relentless. You step out of the tenement into air that tastes like iron. Every block hums with life and decay. Laundry flapping between windows like surrender flags. Gutters running with filth. Children darting barefoot through the muck. There's laughter here, but it's the brittle kind that cracks too easily. Somewhere in the distance, church bells toll. Sunday. For a few brief hours, the factory floor will be silent. And the streets will fill instead with the music of survival. Vendors calling, preachers shouting, mothers bargaining over bruised vegetables. It's chaos, but it's home. For many, this is the only America they'll ever know. A country not of liberty and open fields, but of brick and smoke and narrow stairways that lead nowhere. By now, reformers are everywhere. Journalists with sketchbooks, philanthropists with notebooks, politicians with promises. They come to witness, to photograph, to write. They say they want to help. And maybe some truly do. But even help here feels like intrusion. They stare at the people who live inside these walls as if studying a rare disease. Their articles use words like squalor, decay, moral danger. They forget that the faces in those photographs belong to people who once dreamed of a better life, the same way they do. Yet those stories matter. They break through the polite silence of the wealthy, forcing America to confront what it had built beneath its own feet. Jacob Riis publishes how the other half lives, and suddenly, the darkness of the tenements becomes impossible to ignore. The images burn into the public mind. Children sleeping on fire escapes, women washing laundry in hallways, men dying beside open drains. It's no longer rumor, it's evidence. Change, however, comes in slow, grinding steps. The Tenement House Act of 1901 is passed, the first serious attempt to regulate housing. Windows are required in every room. Air shafts must be widened. Toilets must be installed for every apartment. On paper, it looks revolutionary. In reality, it's barely enough. Landlords resist compliance. They patch cracks with plaster, forge inspection reports, and cram even more families into the same spaces. City inspectors, underpaid and overwhelmed, can't keep up. But the system, once untouchable, has begun to bend. And that bend, that small shift, will one day lead to laws protecting tenants, workers, and children across the country. Inside one of those buildings, a man named Thomas works nights at a printing press. He prints newspapers filled with stories about people just like him, stories that the rich will read over breakfast and then forget. But Thomas doesn't forget. He reads every word, every promise of reform, and he dreams that maybe, someday, his son won't have to live like this. His son, Samuel, is 8. He runs errands for pennies, cleans boots, sometimes sells papers himself. He doesn't go to school. There's no time. But when his father returns home, Samuel asks him to read from the newspapers he prints. He listens to the stories of men demanding justice, women marching for workers' rights, cities trying to build something better. He doesn't understand it all, but he remembers how it makes him feel angry, hopeful, alive. That feeling will follow him his whole life. By the 1910s, the tenement slums begin to thin. Some families, through grit and luck, move uptown or westward, chasing cleaner air and safer streets. Others remain, holding on to what little they know. The city changes around them. Skyscrapers rise, electric lights glow. The roar of automobiles replaces the clatter of horse-drawn carts. But the ghosts of the tenements remain. Every brick, every scarred beam still whispers the same story of human endurance, of suffering turned into survival. And though the walls crumble, their legacy endures in the reforms that follow. Fire codes, building inspections, child labor laws, minimum wage standards, all born from misery, all bought with human lives. It's easy, from a distance, to see the past as progress, a line steadily climbing upward. But if you stood in those hallways, if you felt the rock beneath your feet, you'd know progress wasn't a miracle. It was a battle fought by people who had nothing but each other, by mothers who buried children in nameless graves, by fathers who worked until their hands bled, by children who dreamed of sunlight and clean air and never stopped believing they'd see it. Those dreams built modern America, not the factories, not the tycoons, but the people in the shadows who refused to disappear. Night settles once more over the city. Electric lights flicker where gas lamps once burned. The old tenements stand quiet now, many empty, some demolished, a few preserved as museums. Visitors walk through them, marveling at how anyone could have lived in such conditions. But those who didn't just live, they endured. They built the foundation of the world you walk in today. So the next time you see a crumbling brick building, or a photo of a child in rags smiling faintly at the camera, remember, you wouldn't have survived there. Most wouldn't, but they did. And because they did, the rest of us never had to.